Will there be sadness in heaven? You may think the answer is obviously no, but tonight we're going to see that there's actually a good argument to think that there will be. But how do you square that with scripture and other objections? We'll talk about all that. I'm excited to jump in. My guest is Dr. Adam Pelser. Hey there, Dr. Pelser.
Hi, Jordan. Thanks for having me on the channel with you.
I'm excited. So I want to dive right in, but first, will you mention maybe where you teach right now and also how you got interested in this topic?
Yeah, great. Well, I'm a professor at the Air Force Academy in Colorado Springs, Colorado. So I've been here for about 8 years now, um, and I should say one of the things I have to say as a federal employee is I have to give a little disclaimer and say what I'm going to say on this broadcast is my own views and not the views of the U.S. government or the Air Force or the Department of Defense. I'm just representing myself here. So nice thing is I had the academic freedom to do that. So yeah, that's what I'll be doing here today. How did I get interested in this? Boy, I've been thinking about this, I think, since probably since I was in high school, at least since I was an undergrad. I think I even wrote a paper on this for a class as an undergrad philosophy major at Biola University years and years ago. This question of how can joy in heaven be perfect, especially if there is a hell, right? A lot of people are really worried about this, and they're especially worried about the possibility of loved ones, people that that those in heaven may know personally. Maybe it's a spouse or a child or a parent, a good friend who is maybe not a believer and does not end up being saved. People are really worried about the possibility that, how can I be in heaven and be experiencing this great, eternal, perfect joy in the presence of God and Jesus without that person that I love deeply, especially if I know that they're suffering in some bad way, right? Whatever view we take of hell, right, on the traditional Christian notion of hell, hell's not a desirable place, right? It's not somewhere you want to be, and it's not somewhere that you want the people that you love to be. And so this is a really vexing problem for a lot of people, and I started to struggle with it early on, and I started looking into some of the theological and philosophical answers to the problem, and I just really was dissatisfied with them. They just really didn't sit very well with me, and so I've been struggling with it for a long time, but then had the opportunity to study the nature of emotions in graduate school. I got to work with a great emotion theorist, Bob Roberts, and at Baylor University, and doing work on the nature of the emotions really helped me to think through this issue in a new way, and that's what ultimately led to my recent work on the question.
Excellent. For those interested, I did an interview previously where 4 views were laid out to try and answer the objection that we're about to describe. So let's first lay out that objection, and I may mention those 4 views. The only reason I mention that now is I wasn't satisfied with any of those responses to the objection you're about to hear. So fortunately, I was pointed by a friend to Dr. Pelser's work, and that one was much more satisfactory. So I'm really excited for you to hear his view. But let's first lay out what you call the negative emotions objection.
Good. So the negative emotions objection is essentially what I've already mentioned, this idea that on the traditional Christian belief about heaven is going to be a place of perfect joy, that it's going to be the sort of the best possible human life. And that human life is going to be characterized by a deep and abiding joy in relationship with God and Christ, and in communion with the saints in heaven. But then the negative emotions objection is this idea that, hey, if there is a hell, it looks like that's going to make some people sad, and maybe it would be appropriate to have grief or something like compassion for those who are suffering in hell. And one of the ways that I've put this is as a kind of dilemma, right? So a dilemma is where you've got two possibilities, and neither one of them is particularly desirable, right? Either one of them you really would like to reject. It looks like on the one hand, either Christians, let's just say the inhabitants of heaven, right? Whoever are among the saved or the blessed in heaven, are going to either not be aware of the suffering in hell, in which case they're going to be sort of ignorant of it in a bad way, or they're going to be aware of it but not sort of moved by it, right? In which case they look sort of heartless, right? And so another way of putting this is that the options are either you're going to feel sadness, right, toward those in hell, or you're not, in which case you look heartless. But if you feel the sadness, then that's going to detract from your perfect heavenly joy. So either way you look at it, it doesn't look like there's a really sort of good option here where you get to both be loving and compassionate and at the same time have that perfect heavenly joy.
Very good. Okay, I think you laid that out clearly, that dilemma there. So, as I mentioned a moment ago, I did an interview with Dr. Eric Yang where he laid out 4 responses, and I just wasn't satisfied with those. Now, at the time of doing that interview with Dr. Yang, I thought, you know what? Universalism could solve this objection. If you hold to universalism, then eventually everyone that is in hell would freely choose to be saved and go to heaven. So then there wouldn't be any more sadness. But you point out in this paper that this dilemma is still a problem for the universalists. So how is that?
Yeah, I think it is still a problem for the universalist. And the reason I think so is that the universalist still has the problem. So the universalist is the person that believes that eventually everybody ends up in the heavenly state, right? So this is the view that there is no hell, or if there is a kind of hell, it's only temporal and it doesn't last very long, and everybody kind of gets out of it eventually and gets to live in this heavenly state. So while that might solve the particular problem of hell and the problem that many people have worried about what if I've got a loved one who isn't in heaven with me, right? Won't that diminish my perfect heavenly joy? So universalism would solve that problem. But there's still the worry about memory of painful, traumatic experiences in this life. There's still the worry about what I call ante-mortem, right? Meaning before death. Painful and bad experiences. And these aren't just bad, traumatic, harmful or hurtful experiences that might happen to you, the individual. It could just be bad, traumatic, terrible things that happen to other people that you care about. And of course, central to Christian ethics is this idea that Christians are to love their neighbor as they love themselves. I mean, ideally, we ought to be, just as hurt by the tragedies that befall others as those that befall us or befall those that are our close intimates in our family or our friends. And so if you think that we're going to be able to remember those things, that seems to continue to raise this problem of, okay, how are we going to have perfect heavenly joy? Miroslav Volf is one notable theologian who's worried about this. And in his book, The End of Memory, he argues that we won't remember bad things that happened in this life. We won't remember our own moral faults. We won't remember the traumas that we experienced. He puts it this way. He says, remembering horrendous evils and remembering horrendous evils and experiencing joy, especially joy in one another, are irreconcilable, he says. A world to come that keeps alive the memory of all wrongdoing suffered, and not just of horrendous evils, would not be a place of uplifted, radiant face, but one of eyes downcast in shame, not a place of delight in one another, but a place enveloped in the midst of profound sadness. That's the way he puts it, right? But that's just as much a problem for the universalist as it is for the person who believes in hell.
All right. So I hope for you watching that's clear. There's this dilemma between basically you're sad either because of the ongoing suffering in hell or separation from your loved ones who are in hell on the one hand, or that other one of memory from traumatic experiences that happened to you in this life or or happen to others in this life. You've got the sadness on the one hand, or on the other hand, you can not know about it, but then you look like you kind of just don't care. Or there's something wrong about that. Like there should be a kind of compassion, and there should be a kind of concern and love for it's like you're not loving. Am I catching that right?
Yes, that's right. Yeah. So in a way, I mean, one way to think of it is maybe to complicate things just a little bit, make it a trilemma, right? Where you've got three options. Either you are ignorant of it, you don't know what that there's a hell, or you just completely your memory is blocked about these sort of painful experiences from this life, or you know about it but you don't feel any negative emotions toward it, right? Which makes you look kind of unloving. Or I've lost track of my.
You actually feel sad.
Yeah, or you actually feel sad, but nobody really wants to adopt that view. But that's the one that I'm gonna suggest maybe we should adopt.
Yeah. So that's going to be basically the option that you take. But in the end, you're going to try and argue that that's not going to interfere with our heavenly joy.
That's right. That's right.
Okay, so I hope that is a teaser for the viewers, and they're really intrigued and stick around. Okay, before we get into the details of that response, can you just, I mean, we kind of hinted at it. What do you try to argue in the paper?
So the basic overview, sort of big picture argument is that I think negative emotions, and by that I mean emotions that feel bad, negative emotions can be valuable, and that maybe they will continue to be valuable even in heaven. Now, of course, the trick there is to say, well, how can we continue to have those negative emotions without diminishing our heavenly joy? And so I want to argue for a view of heavenly joy that allows a place for some limited, right, set of negative emotions. I don't want to allow a place for lots of things that we might consider negative, painful emotions. I want to say, yes, of course, negative heavenly joy is going to rule out certain, really kind of nasty things that we might experience. But might there be room for some of what we might call negative emotions in heaven? I want to say yes, and that doesn't diminish heavenly joy. And in fact, maybe it might actually enhance our heavenly joy.
Okay, so your response is going to hinge on getting clear what emotions are. So what are emotions?
Yeah. So on the view that I adopt, and this is a controversial view, not everybody holds this view, but on the view that I adopt, emotions are a kind of perception of value. So I am what philosophers call an axiological realist. I believe that value is a real thing. I believe that there's real value in the world. There's real beauty in the world. There's real goodness in the world. That justice and injustice are some real things that exist in the world, and they have good or bad value. And I think that the emotions are our primary way, or at least one primary way, in which we access that value, in which we experience that value. So in the same way that our five senses are the way that we perceive the physical world, we perceive the realities of the physical world through our five senses, I think that we perceive value, we perceive beauty, we perceive moral goodness, we perceive admirability, we perceive generosity, the goodness of generosity. We perceive those things, I think, through our emotions. We have these sort of emotional experiences that helped us to get in touch with those realities. And so I think that the emotions are important both epistemically and morally. We're gonna, I think, get to that. But by epistemically, I mean that they put us in a kind of cognitive contact with something real, an objective set of values that are out there in the world.
I had never heard of this view before reading the paper, but I really like the sound of it. So it strikes me as very plausible. So I need to explore it more. But with that view on the table, what are two features of our emotional experience that are relevant to the way we conceive of emotional experience in heaven?
Well, I think one of the features is that they can be morally bad or morally good, right? So you can have what you might call morally negative emotions. There are some emotions that are just bad to feel, right? They're bad in a moral sense. They don't just hurt, right? In fact, some of them are kind of pleasurable, right? But they're bad to feel. So for example, envy. Envy is an emotion that on some traditions, especially in the Christian tradition, is thought of as a deeply negative emotion, right? It's a kind of Thomas Aquinas calls it a kind of sadness toward the good of another. If somebody that I love, if a friend has something good happen to them, then the loving thing to feel would be a kind of joy for them. I should be happy for them that they had this good thing happen. But sometimes we all unfortunately experience this from time to time. A good thing happens to somebody that we love, or maybe somebody that we don't love all that much. A good thing happens to them, and instead of feeling happy for them, we get a sort of, oh, I wish that would have happened to me, right?
Yeah.
I don't want good things to happen to them. I want it to happen to me. So if we're, some colleague gets a promotion that we would have really liked to get, or somebody gets a publishing contract and we would have really liked to have that publishing contract, or somebody else gets into a college and you were hoping to get into that college and you don't, right? Or you didn't get into the college that you want. And so you just feel this sadness at those good things that are happening. That's not a morally positive emotion, right? That's not something that we should try to cultivate. It's something that we should actually try to get rid of. So in that sense, some emotions can be morally negative. On the other hand, they can be morally positive, right? An emotion like compassion, for example, we typically think of as a generally morally positive emotion. It's good to feel compassion for the suffering, right? Compassion is a kind of, to put it in these sort of perceptual terms that I was talking about earlier, I think compassion is a kind of perception of someone who is suffering, and where you feel that it would be good that their suffering be put to an end, right? That their suffering be ameliorated somehow. Compassion is that kind of perception that they are suffering, and that their suffering is something that's not desirable. So compassion, I want to say, is a kind of morally positive emotion. It's generally a good thing. It can go bad, but it's generally a kind of good emotion that we should try to cultivate, and we should try to figure out how to sort of get it right? I mean, have it actually fit the situation correctly. Whereas envy is a kind of negative emotion in the sense that it's a bad one to have. But here's the interesting thing about compassion. Compassion hurts a little bit, right? We even sometimes express it this way. We say, when we're talking about our compassion, we say, my heart hurts for that person, right? Or my heart hurts for that situation. And so we express it in this way where we recognize that it is a kind of painful emotion. So that's the affect, I want to say. So affect, A-F-F-E-C-T, right? Of an emotion is its feel, the way it feels. And some emotions have a kind of negative affect. They don't feel good. But even some morally good emotions can not feel good, right? Mm-hmm. They can be morally positive, but at the same time have this kind of negative affect, right? This negative sort of painful feel to them. And similarly, some emotions can feel good, but actually be morally bad, right? So, Schadenfreude, right? This sort of taking pleasure in somebody else's misfortune and destruction. That's kind of characteristically morally bad emotion, that it's bad, it would be bad to feel, and that the virtuous person should try to sort of get rid of that, or the person who wants to grow in virtue should try to get rid of that emotion. But it's a kind of positive feeling, right? It feels good, right? To take pleasure in somebody else's misfortune. And so I want to distinguish those two things. And I want to really focus in on this idea of negative affect. Now, I don't think anybody I don't want to make the argument that we're going to have any morally bad emotions, right? So sort of morally negative emotions in heaven. But I do want to open up the possibility that maybe some affectively negative emotions, some emotions that have that sort of painful feel to them that hurt a little bit, might have a place in heaven without diminishing our heavenly joy. Again, that's the key, is to try and make that case. And the reason I think that's important is that the negative affect of an emotion is an important part of what puts us in touch with the value reality, right? It's through the sort of somewhat painful feeling of fear, the painful affect of fear, that we are impressed with, that we sort of appreciate the danger of a situation, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's through the kind of feel of anger, the affect of anger, that we sort of perceive and get to know or appreciate the injustice that we're perceiving. That's, I think, anger is a kind of perception of injustice or perception of an offense. But the anger, the way that we perceive that, it sort of comes through that sort of negative, painful feel that says, ooh, justice is being violated, and that's not good. That feeling, and again, this is not just like a physiological feeling. It's not just like, tingling in the, in the skin, or the heart pumping faster or something like that. I think there's more than that to the affect of emotion. I think that's how we get to know and appreciate and sort of experience these objective values in reality that are out there.
Excellent. Okay. And you already hinted at how this is going to look at the negative emotions objection. So your answer to the negative emotions objection would be, you take that horn of the dilemma or trilemma, however you lay out the problem. You take the horn where you do know about the suffering of those in hell, or the suffering that from our past life, or from our life on earth. You do know about it, but and it causes that feeling of hurt, like when we say my heart hurts for you. But that feeling is actually putting you in touch with reality, and that's a positive feature. That's something, even though it feels bad, it's actually valuable. Do I have the right idea?
Yeah, that's right. That it's valuable, and I want to say it's valuable in two senses. Having that sort of negative affect can be valuable in two ways. I've already mentioned that the way in which it's epistemically valuable. So epistemically just means having to do with our cognitive life, sort of our knowledge or our understanding of the world. I think that the negative feel of emotion, if there is a real negative reality out there to be experienced, the way that we experience that is through this negative affect. It's through this negative feel of some of these painful emotions. And so it has epistemic value in that it gets us in touch with, it helps us to understand, or maybe even to appreciate, have a kind of appreciation for the badness of bad things and the goodness of good things, the beauty of beautiful things. But I also think that it's morally valuable, and I've sort of mentioned that too. Is that compassion is an emotion that I think is a morally valuable emotion, but it has this kind of negative affect, this negative feel to it. It hurts a little bit, but to not feel compassion on the suffering is a kind of moral failure, oftentimes, right? What it is to love, right? Our neighbor as ourselves sometimes means to feel compassion for them. In fact, in Jesus' famous parable of the Good Samaritan, it says not only that the Good Samaritan passed by and helped, but that the Good Samaritan passed by and felt compassion for the man who was beaten and left on the side of the road to die. Right? It was his love, his neighbor love, his charity for this suffering person was expressed not just through his actions of helping to take care, but through his heart of compassion for the individual.
Very good. Now, so you're saying, yeah, we'll have this negative affect. So we want to take that horn, but somebody can think, okay, well, you took that horn, but doesn't that spoil the heavenly joy then? How do you still have heavenly joy?
That's right.
So I want you to speak to that, but I'm gonna pause that question, because before we do that, you point out that there are some notable Christians, both in the past and in the present, who wanted who want to say, no, we don't want to allow this kind of sadness in. It would spoil heavenly joy. And these individuals are Aquinas, C.S. Lewis, and N.T. Wright.
Yeah.
So can you just summarize what they say and maybe critique that a little bit?
These are, by the way, three theologians and philosophical theologians that I admire greatly. So anytime I'm doing work and I have to sort of argue against three thinkers that I admire so greatly, like these three, it always sort of makes me a little nervous. I got to be real careful here, right? But I think that. That all three of these thinkers have tried to solve this problem of the negative emotions objection to heavenly joy, in various ways, and I'm just sort of dissatisfied with each of them. And so I'll sort of give you just a real brief characterization of each of them, because they all sort of try a slightly different solution. So Aquinas, his view, and those of your viewers who watched your interview with Dr. Eric Yang will already be familiar with this from that interview. His view is essentially that when the blessed in heaven think about or are sort of aware of the suffering of those in hell, they're going to experience positive emotions. They're going to experience emotions like they're going to rejoice in the justice of God. They're going to sort of focus on that the justice of God is being manifested in the fact that here we have, some people who rejected God or resisted his love, and now his justice is being displayed somehow through their pain and their suffering. So Aquinas says we're not going to rejoice in their pain and suffering, right? Not directly, but indirectly, because it points us toward the justice of God. He says this. He says, whoever pities another shares somewhat in his unhappiness, but the blessed cannot share in any unhappiness. Therefore, they do not pity the affections of the damned. That's Aquinas. So he thinks that when we have this kind of pity or compassion or something, we share in the unhappiness, and since we have perfect heavenly joy, the blessed aren't going to experience that unhappiness, and so they're not going to have these what I've called affectively negative emotions. So that's Aquinas' view, right? Is that when we look at hell, we're going to be aware of it, right? He doesn't think that we're just not going to be aware of it. He thinks we're going to be aware of it, but when we think about it, when we reflect on it, we're going to be pointed toward good things, positive things, like the justice of God and like our gratitude that we ourselves were saved, right? That's Aquinas' view. That one is unsatisfying to me, I think probably for some obvious reasons. I just think that, well, I agree with Aquinas that the blessed will see the positive aspects of the suffering in hell, right? They will see God's justice, and they will be pointed toward gratitude. They will sort of be encouraged toward gratitude for their own salvation and blessedness. I also think that they will not be unaware of the sort of the negative side of that coin, right? They will also see it from all angles, right? They'll see the reality of hell, which is a negative reality. They'll see it from its negative angles as well. And I think that seems to suggest the possibility of affectively negative emotions. So that's Aquinas' view. Another view is C.S. Lewis's view. Now, C.S. Lewis very quickly, in a book called The Problem of Pain, makes a kind of case here against the negative emotions objection. And he says this objection really gets raised because people are confused about the sort of the temporality of hell. They think of hell and heaven being on these sort of parallel timelines, right? And he says it's kind of like the history of England and America, where the people in heaven will be able to say, oh, that's going on in hell now, right? Like that's happening now. And he says, well, that's probably not the best way to think about it, right? Hell, we get this picture of hell in scripture, he thinks, where it emphasizes the finality of hell. This is going to be the final sort of resting place of the damned, but it might not go on forever, right? So it might be this is sort of like maybe an annihilationist view where eventually these people who live in hell are just going to stop existing at some point. And so then the people in heaven are going to be able to go on rejoicing and having this perfect joy because there's not actually going to be a hell throughout eternity. I'm worried about that for a couple of reasons. One is I'm worried about it because I actually think that the picture of hell that we get in Scripture is a picture of a kind of eternal place. That's one worry, and that's sort of based on some biblical interpretation. But my other worry about that is that even if he's right, even if we grant something like annihilationism, and we say, okay, sure, they're going to cease to exist at some point, I still think that that's an incredibly tragic end of their existence that ought to be remembered and lamented by those in heaven, right? If people, once reflecting the image of God, right? People with dignity, people who God made and who Jesus came and died for, resist God to the point of ending in hell and then sort of pass out of existence. It seems to me that that's an incredibly tragic thing that deserves our attention and deserves our lament and deserves maybe something like sadness over that negative reality. And so I'm not sure that just by cutting off the existence of those in hell at some temporal point that really solves the problem. It seems to me that just raises a slightly more complicated problem. But so I'm not satisfied by C.S. Lewis's view either. And then, but he says something else, and he doesn't really use this as a response to the negative emotions objection. But he says very quickly in one place, he says, "Hell was not made for men." That the people who end up in hell are sort of going to go through this process, he thinks, of what we might call dehumanization. They're going to actually become less and less human because they're so mired in their sin, right? As they sort of grow, I think Lewis's idea is that as people sort of grow in love and union with God, they become more and more perfectly human. But then as they sort of become more and more entrenched in their sin and given over to their sinful nature, they become less and less human. And so he does make this claim at one point that maybe hell is not even a place for humanity. Now, he doesn't really use this to respond to the negative emotions objection, but N.T. Wright does. N.T. Wright says in his book, Surprised by Hope, that maybe the people who inhabit hell are no longer really human, and so therefore don't really deserve anything like our compassion or our sadness. They've become sort of literally dehumanized. But once again, I want to say the same thing to that view that I said about the annihilationist view, which is, it seems to me that that's a really tragic end of human existence. The pinnacle of God's creation, right? The human beings who reflect his image and who bear his image in the world, that he created and called them good. And now they've become so deteriorated in their sin that they're no longer even really human. That strikes me as an incredibly tragic end to their existence that, again, the blessed in heaven, if they're aware of it, should feel sort of badly about.
Mm-hmm. Very good. Okay, so you summarized all those views very well, and some of that got discussed again in that interview with Dr. Eric Yang. So I would encourage you, if you're enjoying this interview, definitely go check that one out. It's worth exploring those options. I don't mean to turn anybody off of those options. I'm glad I did, but I want to feature this one because I'm really excited about it. Okay, so now I want to return to this this point about, okay, say you're right, Dr. Pelser, and so we feel this, the negative affect. Won't that spoil the joy of heaven? So how do you reconcile those negative heavenly emotions with perfect heavenly joy?
All right, good. Yeah, now this is the real hard part, right? I mean, so far so good. I get to just say, hey, maybe there's going to be sadness in heaven, and that's why the inhabitants of heaven won't be unloving, and that's why they won't be sort of problematically forgetful of, bad things that happened in this life, or of the problem of hell. But here's the rub, right? How do you get the experience of negative emotions with the experience of perfect heavenly joy, right? Because joy in heaven is supposed to be perfect. So here's where I want to draw on some recent pop culture here. I'm going to talk about a Pixar movie called Inside Out. So some of you may be familiar with this Pixar movie. It's already getting a little bit dated, I'm afraid, but when it came out, I was really excited about it because it's all about emotions, right? Now I have some problems with some of the presentation of the emotions in the film, but overall I thought it was a really fun and interesting film about the nature of emotions. And but the best part about the film, and I think the reason why so many people loved the movie as much as they did, is that the hero in the movie is sadness, right? Sadness in the beginning of the movie, everybody, all the other emotions are like, okay, get out of the way, right? Don't touch anything. Go stand in the corner, right? Try to avoid, because sadness always just sort of messes things up. It's not a good thing, right? Fear's got its place. It keeps us away from danger, and anger's got its place, right? It sort of fights for justice, right? And gets fairness. And of course, joy is sort of the hero, right? Early on, everybody wants joy. Joy seems great, but sadness, you're just kind of causing problems. But sadness ends up being the hero in the movie, right? And I won't sort of give away the whole story, right? For those of you who haven't seen it, but sadness ends up being the hero because sadness helps the girl, right? The sort of the owner of these emotions to deal with the difficult things that are going on in her life, and just sort of be appropriately in touch with them, and sort of recognize them, recognize the pain, recognize the what I would call negative realities that existed in her world, and then try to sort of be comforted by her parents, by others, by her community, right? Sort of move forward from that sadness, not get rid of it, but sort of accept it and internalize it and live with it. And I think that picture, I think, helps us to see how maybe sadness and maybe some other negative emotions, in my paper on this topic, I talk about somberness, which I think is a kind of slightly negatively affective feeling of the seriousness. I say the grave seriousness of something, right? So somberness is sort of like the emotion that you would feel at a funeral, or at a sort of a murder trial, right? It would be inappropriate to sort of experience joy or sort of happy emotions, right? In that kind of a context. And so I say maybe sadness and somberness might have a place, and they might actually contribute to overall human flourishing, right? To the full well-being of the individual. And I've already started to explain how. One is through the sort of epistemic contact with reality. I think these negative emotions can help us to sort of feel the weight of the negative realities, right? And know them and sort of appreciate them. And I think there's something valuable about that cognitive connection with reality, right? Not being ignorant of the realities that are out there. On the other hand, they can be morally valuable, right? It can be a way of kind of expressing our love, of it can be a manifestation of our love to feel some of these negative emotions. So, but this requires that we give up a sort of popular view of heavenly joy, which has it that perfect heavenly joy is going to be this sort of uninterrupted, constant stream of good affective feelings, right? Happy feelings all the time, uninterrupted. And I think of clearly my view, right? If sadness and somberness, or maybe other kinds of negative, affectively negative emotions might be experienced in heaven, we clearly have to give up that view of heavenly joy. We can't say that we're going to have this sort of uninterrupted, endless, eternal stream of positive affective feelings. But I don't think that that's really how we ought to characterize perfect heavenly joy anyway. I think perfect heavenly joy might have a place for sadness, because if we think of it more in terms of a kind of deep human flourishing, right, a kind of settled pleasure in the relationship with God that we have, in the communion of the saints that we have in heaven, if we think of it that way, where we can actually be aware of certain negative realities, either past or even possibly present, as in the problem of an eternal hell. If we can be aware of those and yet comforted by God's love and responsive to that love, and it doesn't seem to me that that's going to be a diminishment of heavenly joy. It might actually be, if we're thinking of joy as a kind of human flourishing, something like Aristotle's notion of eudaimonia, blessedness or flourishing. Maybe these negatively affective emotions might actually enhance our heavenly joy. They might enhance our well-being and our flourishing as human beings, living in this perfected state. Uh-oh, Jordan? Jordan? I don't know what happened, but I can't hear you.
Oh, I'm sorry. I think I accidentally hit the mute button.
Okay, all right.
Yeah, okay. So you can hear me now. Sorry about that. What I was saying was that was helpful, and you actually give a couple of examples in the paper to try and lend psychological plausibility to this compatibility claim that these negative affective emotions are compatible with heavenly joy. So can you just say those couple of examples? I found them helpful.
Yeah, so the first example that I use is when I'm thinking about, sort of ante-mortem, right, prior to death, past experiences of evil. I use the example of the remembrance of the Holocaust. So some of the viewers may be familiar with this tradition, but there is a day that the nation of Israel celebrates, Yom HaShoah, where it's a day of remembrance, and it's a day of remembrance of the victims of the Holocaust and also of the heroes who resisted the Nazis in the Holocaust in order just to try and save lives. And so on this day, the entire nation of Israel sort of shuts down around 10 a.m. Sirens blare for about a minute. Everybody stands in silence. People will even stop driving on highways, get out of their cars to have a moment of silence. Businesses shut down during this day. It's a day of remembrance of this tragic event. Now, of course, one reason to remember a tragic event like that is to try and prevent it from happening again in the future. And of course, that there's no reason to think that we need to remember past evils in order to prevent them from happening in heaven, right? Because this is going to be a place where there is no more evil, no more sin. But another reason to remember tragic events like the Holocaust is to recognize the value of the victims and the great disvalue, the great evil of what was done to them. Just to sort of rest in that and say, acknowledge, yes, these people were valuable and something really terrible happened, and that's worth remembering. Just as a way of sort of recognizing the value or disvalue that existed in that situation. And I don't know why those kinds of remembrances need to stop, right, in the afterlife, in heaven. And also, I'm not sure why we should think of them as diminishing joy. I don't think of the practice of sort of that kind of contemplative remembrance, even though it is a somber and a sad practice and involves the experience of negative emotions. I don't think that detracts from a truly joyful life. Similarly, another example is the practice that many Christians engage in of Good Friday services, right? So participating in a kind of Good Friday liturgical service, many are designed intentionally to evoke affectively negative emotions like sadness and somberness, a kind of a deep awareness and appreciation, emotional appreciation of the cost that was paid for our salvation by Jesus Christ on the cross, right? Good Friday is good, right? We call it good, but it is a dark good. It's a good that that doesn't feel good always when we reflect on it, because something so terrible had to happen in order for our salvation to be purchased by God. And so when we think about that cost that God in Christ paid on our behalf, it evokes these negative emotions. But I don't think that by participating in Good Friday services, Christians who have hope in the resurrection and who have joy in the Lord are diminishing their Christian joy, right? But it is an important moment of remembrance. And I'm not sure that this is even just an analogy for the way that we might experience negative emotions in heaven. I'm not sure why we won't continue to remember the crucifixion in a kind of Good Friday
service. I would think that would be crazy if we're in heaven if we don't remember the crucifixion.
All we're ever going to do is think about the resurrection and the good part and forget the bad. I just don't think that that's a sort of psychologically realistic picture of what heavenly joy is going to be like. And so in the same way that I don't think participating in a Good Friday service in this life sort of detracts from my joy as a Christian, I don't think that having these sort of moments of sadness or somber reflection on negative realities will detract from perfect heavenly joy in heaven.
I found those two examples really helpful, and that makes a lot of sense to me, especially when you frame this idea of heavenly joy in terms of flourishing, or you said a word that I'm not quite sure how to say it, Aristotelian.
Yeah. Sorry, eudaimonia. So eudaimonia is Aristotle and Plato, the ancient Greeks' notion of happiness. Sometimes it gets translated this way as happiness, but the Greek word is eudaimonia, and daimon is sort of the Greek word for like a spirit or a god, right? And so there's a sense in which it's a sort of goodness that comes from the god, right? It's sort of a blessedness, right? They had this really rich idea that to flourish as a human being is more than just to feel good all the time, right? But that it's to be a sort of well-functioning, excellent, virtuous, fully formed, as you're supposed to be kind of human being. That's this notion of eudaimonia. And so the picture that I'm suggesting of heavenly joy is, I think, closer to that than this kind of thin, blissfully ignorant kind of, always happy all the time because we're not really paying attention to bad things happening in the world, right? Kind of picture that that so many people, I think, hold of heavenly joy. I just think that that's not a very rich and robust way of thinking about the joy that we'll have in heaven. And I think this kind of Greek notion of eudaimonia is maybe sort of closer in the neighborhood. I don't think it's exactly the same, but I think it kind of gets a little bit closer to this idea of how we could experience a real sort of deep flourishing as a human being while in having some of these, what I call affectively negative emotions. Yeah.
All right, we are getting close to the time for Q&A. So if you have a question, I've seen 3 in the live chat, 1 from Andrew Moon, 1 from Justin Mooney, and 1 from Zach Raymer. So if you have a question, type it in right now. Just put the word question at the beginning. We're gonna, before we go to Q&A, we want to look at some objections to your view. So one obvious objection to me that comes to mind is Revelation 21:4. So I'm going to read Revelation 21:4. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and death will not exist anymore, or mourning, or crying, or pain, for the former things have ceased to exist. Okay, so that seems like an obvious objection to your view. How do you want to respond to that?
I think, this is I think the hardest objection, right? At least it's the hardest biblical objection. But I think maybe this can be read in a way that is consistent with the view that I'm suggesting, and here's how. Certainly, I think John is writing to first century Christian believers who are undergoing a terrible persecution. I think, this is my view of the timing of the book of Revelation, is that this is being written at the time of the Neronian persecution, so Nero's persecution of the Christians, where they're literally being covered in tar and lit as human torches. They're being ripped apart by animals in theaters. There is a terrible persecution of Christians going on in Rome at the time. And John is writing to these churches as a kind of encouragement. And I think that when John writes to these Christians and says, yes, there will one day finally be the new Jerusalem coming down out of heaven, that we will live with Christ, and everything will be perfect in the final state of things, right? In the final paradise. And he says, there will be no more death. There will be no more crying. There will be no more pain. One way to read that is as a just sort of straightforward objection to my view, right? It's just going to be no sadness, no negative emotions. We'll never feel anything bad again. But I think another way to read that is he's saying, look, there will be no more evil of the kind that you're experiencing right now, right? John's readers were not looking for salvation from the affectively negative feeling of emotions like sadness and somberness over the crucifixion, right? They weren't looking to be saved from the bad feelings that they get from their Good Friday services. And I don't even think that they were looking to be saved from the kind of sadness and somberness that one might feel in heaven for loved ones who are not existing in heaven. They were looking to be saved from a world where there was terror and great evil and murder and rape and torture. And those things will not exist in heaven. We will live in a place where there will no longer be any injustice. There will no longer be any racism. There will no longer be any sexism. There will no longer be any torture or terrorism, right? And that is truly cause for great joy. But I think maybe that can be consistent with God wiping away every tear from every eye. And maybe that's an ongoing reality. Maybe that doesn't have to be a one time God says, it's all okay, it's all better now. But maybe for all eternity, God will wipe away every tear from every eye. And to be in that kind of rich, loving relationship with our Heavenly Father, to be in that kind of relationship with Jesus Christ, who died for our sins in order to save us, and then says, I'm here and I will comfort you. To be in the presence of God, the creator of the universe, who is comforting us and wiping away the tears from our eyes for all eternity, sounds to me like a place where there could be great joy, even with some sadness and somberness.
Yeah. Okay, so I mentioned a biblical objection there. Are there other objections that have come up in response to this paper or this view?
Yeah, I mean, they're the traditional ones, right? I mean, so there is going to be worries here about, well, why couldn't we just explain this in a better way, right? Why couldn't we just explain this with a kind of forgetfulness, right? A lack of memory. That's Miroslav Volf's concern. Is that any memory of sort of the bad things we've committed or things that have been done to us from this life in heaven is just going to so detract from heavenly joy that it's not even going to be joy at all, let alone perfect. I mean, it'll just be a miserable place, right? So there are folks who think that maybe that it might be a better solution to the problem. But I think the big one is that people just really sort of struggle with this idea that how could you have affectively negative emotions sort of ongoing throughout eternity and yet still think of that as perfect heavenly joy? And so I think I've tried to make a kind of case for suggesting that that's plausible. The other worry, I think, is that, in a way, of course, this is speculative philosophical theology. I'm talking about some things that are uncertain. In fact, when I first started working on this project years and years ago, I was driving my son Luke to school one day. I think he was about 4th grade or 5th grade at the time. And I said, today I'm going to work on a paper where I'm thinking about whether there can be sadness in heaven. And he said, oh, that's interesting. Well, what do you think? What are you going to say? And I said, I'm not sure. And his response immediately was, good, you shouldn't be. And I said, that's a real wisdom, right? I mean, that this is a speculative view, right? I'm trying to suggest the possibility of a way of solving the negative emotions objection, but I grant that I'm speculating here about the nature and the value of emotions that might exist in heaven, and there's not a lot of scriptural warrant for the view or sort of philosophical reasons to believe in it other than the ones that I've given here, and so I myself hold the view sort of tentatively. Yeah.
Okay, I want to go to Q&A. So again, if you have a question for Dr. Pelser, put it in the live chat. Just put the word question at the beginning. While you're doing that, please consider becoming one of my patrons. Right now, I have to devote a lot of my time to little side jobs to make ends meet. But by supporting me monthly, you're actually allowing me to devote more of my time to creating content for this channel. And also, you're helping to support my wife and 2-year-old son. So I appreciate all of my current patrons. Thank you all so much. I couldn't do this without your support. Okay. The link, by the way, to become a patron's in the description of the video. So you can go to that link and click and join. You get early access to videos and lots of good content. All right. I want to go to the questions. Andrew Moon asked, for the dilemma, isn't there the option that we will still know about suffering in heaven, but we just aren't thinking about it? We don't have to consciously think about everything we know.
Yeah, that's a great question, Andrew. I think I want to answer yes. I think that is a possibility. On the other hand, I think that there are some negative realities that deserve a kind of continual remembrance and reflection, even if it is sort of just for those moments, right? So think of the Good Friday service example or the Yom HaShoah example, right? Maybe for all eternity, the inhabitants of heaven will, for much of the time, not be reflecting on, not be focusing on the negative reality of hell, not be focusing on past evils like the Holocaust, but will rather be focusing their attention on their loving relationships with others in the communion of the saints, with their communion with God and Christ, with the glory of God, with worshiping Him, right? So I certainly think that I want to say that my view is consistent with the idea that for much of the sort of experience of heavenly life, the inhabitants of heaven will not be sort of just dwelling on the negative realities and sad feelings about them. But nevertheless, I think there is something really important about occasionally, right, in a kind of rhythm of life, reflecting on those realities, because they do seem really important and worth reflecting on and deserving of the attention of those in heaven, not just sort of a one-time, hey, we've reflected and now we've moved on because we're in heaven. But I think a kind of continual, maybe rhythmic reflection that leads to those kinds of sad and somber or negative emotions might be still appropriate in heaven and might be a kind of expression of love and virtue in heaven.
All right, the next question comes from Zach Raymer. Ethicists such as Linda Zagzebski, I always struggle to say that name, as I understand them, speak of emotions' dispositional content. Admiring someone motivates me to activate a disposition to act like the admirable person. The speaker speaks about a perceptual or epistemic content, but not acting on a disposition. And here's the question part. How would I act on my dispositive compassion on those in hell?
That's a great question. I think what I want to say in response to that is that So one thing I want to say, I know I talked about compassion earlier, and I have to now sort of backtrack a little bit. I don't actually think that compassion is going to be one of the emotions, the affectively negative emotions that people in heaven will experience, because I think compassion involves a kind of a desire to remove the suffering. And I think because if there is a hell and it's going to be perfectly just, that those in heaven will see it as perfectly just and will not desire to sort of overrule God's will by, removing the suffering of those in hell. So I actually think that's why I focus on sadness and somberness, is because I think compassion maybe involves this kind of dispositional quality to want to remove that suffering. But with the other negative emotions, like sadness, for example, I'm not sure that it involves anything except just sort of it's a, to use the perceptual language, I think it's a sort of perception of the loss of something really valuable or someone really valuable in a kind of permanent or irrevocable way. And I think what does sadness sort of prompt us to do? What does it dispose us to do? Well, sometimes it disposes us to simply to grieve or to lament. And so maybe there will be room for some kind of lament in heaven. It might prompt us perhaps to even express our lament to God and say, God, we know you're just, and we know you're perfectly loving. Please just address this suffering, show your mercy in your justice. And so maybe it will be a sort of prompt, a sort of request of God. But I think maybe a prompting of a request of God, or a prompting of lament, or a prompting of grieving, just sort of going through that process of grief, but not an overwhelming grief, not one that would cancel perfect heavenly joy, but some level of grief might seem appropriate. So I think that's what I would say. Maybe sadness or somberness might sort of dispose us to do in heaven.
All right, Justin Mooney asked, what are the limits of sadness in heaven? Are they generous enough to allow ongoing devastation over the suffering or absence due to annihilation of loved ones?
Yeah, that's a great question, Justin. So I actually have a list of emotions that I mentioned in my paper that I say would be sort of joy-canceling emotions. They include things like despair, a kind of deep loneliness, overwhelming grief, right? I mean, these kinds of emotions, hatred, right? Emotions that I just want to say, clearly those would cancel out, would diminish in a really sort of negative way, perfect heavenly joy. And so I want to allow for sadness, but not a kind of overwhelming grief. I mean, even Paul says in Thessalonians that the Christians do not grieve as those who have no hope, right? That their own grief over the deaths of their loved ones is tinged with hope in the resurrection. And so it's sort of that hope infuses that grief and colors it and shapes it in a way that makes it different from the kind of despairing grief that people have when they have no hope. And so I want to say something similar about heavenly emotions, but at an even greater scale, that the sadness experienced is going to be so informed by God's love and so informed by our knowledge of God's justice and his mercy and his grace and by our joy, right? By our perfect joy, that the sadness isn't going to be overwhelming, but still might be experienced as a kind of a negatively affective experience. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
It looks like Justin had a follow-up on that question, so I'll put it up. And then we've got one more after this. He says, is there hope for those not in heaven? Seems like only universalism is going to give you that.
Yeah, I didn't mean to suggest that hope in heaven would inform the sadness, but rather, although if you went with something like an annihilationist view or a universalist view, maybe some sort of temporary hope might work. But rather that joy, that the comfort of God's love and grace, that those would be the kinds of things that would infuse and sort of shape that in the same way that in this life, our hope in the resurrection shapes our grief over death. Yeah, so I didn't mean to suggest that hope would be experienced in heaven, although I'm not sure.
All right. Tim asked, could you comment on whether there will be a memory of our own sins?
Yeah, I think so, Tim. I think this is Miroslav Volf's really big concern. He's worried that if we remember our own sins, that we're going to be sort of overcome with shame and guilt and not be able to experience great joy in heaven. But I just have to reject that. I think, no, of course we'll remember our sins, because if we don't, then what sense will the crucifixion make? What sense will the resurrection make? What sense will our salvation make if we have no memory of the sin from which we were saved? Now, that being said, I do think that the blessed in heaven will have a kind of distance from the person with the sinful nature that they once were. They will still identify with that person and say, yes, that was me, but also in another sense, that's no longer me. I now live in Christ. Christ's righteousness now lives in me perfectly. And so while that was me who committed those sins then, I'm no longer that same person. I am now a new person in Christ. And I think, the way Paul talks in his letters in the New Testament, he thinks that the Christian's already supposed to be starting to live that way and think that way about their own identity, even in this life. And I think that'll be even more perfected in heaven. But I don't think that that's going to entail a sort of complete forgetfulness of our past sins, or that it was me who was guilty of those sins at one time.
All right. Last question here, and a softball. Where might the paper on this be available? I would love to read it. Great interview, by the way. Thank you so much, Marcel.
Yeah. So the paper originally appeared in this book. I've got it right here. It's called Paradise Understood: New Philosophical Essays About Heaven, edited by Ryan Byerly and Eric Silverman. It's a great volume of essays. Unfortunately, it's not easy to get your hands on. It's a hardback. It's a fairly expensive academic volume. I have a sort of pre-publication version of the chapter available on my own website, adampelser.com, and also on my academia page. But and if it's not there, I'll put it there right away. I think it's there.
It is. Okay. Yeah, and I put the link to your website in the description of the video. Okay. So great. Definitely don't just check out this paper. Check out his other papers as well. They look very good. And you also had a book that just came out. Why don't you say something about that?
Oh, good. Yeah, I don't have it. I don't have it right here with me. Otherwise, I'd show it to you too. I have a great volume of essays that just came out with a lot of great contributors that I really admire. So I was glad to be part of the project. But I co-edited it with my friend Scott Cleveland. It's called Faith and Virtue Formation. The subtitle is Christian Philosophy in Aid of Becoming Good. And it's a collection of essays that we published and dedicated to Bob Roberts, who I mentioned earlier, my dissertation director and a great emotion theorist. And it's a collection of essays on applying Christian philosophy and theology to thinking about growth in virtue, spiritual formation, moral formation, and so it's a very sort of practically oriented philosophy volume. And I'd encourage you all to check that out if you can get your hands on a copy. And if it's too expensive, but you have access to a library, or you're affiliated with a church or with a university that has a library budget, encourage them to buy a copy and then borrow it for free. That'd be even better.
Yeah. Well, before we end the interview, would you like to say anything to conclude the discussion we've had?
Well, Jordan, this has been great. I hope I was not able to keep track of everything that was in the chat comments. So if I missed something and there were things said in the chat comments that I missed, feel free to reach out to me personally if you want to follow up. But again, this is in some ways it's a kind of speculative piece, but it is. I think that this view has some possible pastoral purchase, and I think philosophically it seems defensible to me. I also think scripturally it seems defensible, even though there are some passages that, like Revelation 21, that are tricky for the view. I think it's a view that seems plausible to me, and it seems like it paints a picture of heaven that suggests that perfect heavenly joy can be not heartless, not unloving, and also not problematically forgetful of bad realities, and yet still perfectly joyful, living in the presence and communion with the God who loves us and who will wipe away every tear from our eyes, whether that's a one-time thing or it goes on for eternity. Being comforted by our Heavenly Father, I think, is a picture that all people ought to want, and I hope they're inspired by this way of thinking to turn to Him for comfort in their own tragedies and in their own sadness.
Well, thank you so much for coming on. I really enjoyed it, and I'd love to have you back sometime.
Great. I'd love to, Jordan. Well, thanks for having me on, and thanks everybody who's been paying attention and putting up comments in the chats. Thanks for hanging with us, and I look forward to reading through them more carefully once I'm off the screen here.
Yeah. Before you go, I'll mention again, check out the interview with Dr. Yang, where he offered 4 responses to this problem. And also the link to that, by the way, is in the description of the video. And also, please, if you enjoyed this interview, consider giving this video a like and consider subscribing to the channel. That helps this channel to grow and reach a larger audience. All right. Thank you so much, and we'll see you next time.